So I still have a long list of videos that I intend to produce, and I work through that list as time and circumstance allow. Now this is one I have been looking forward to as it relates to one of my favourite activities, and that is flying aircraft. Some time ago on my channel I was asked the question about the Space Shuttle and whether I believed an object that heavy is capable of gliding, and the answer to that question is absolutely yes, I do. Any object with a lift to drag ratio greater than 1 is capable of gliding. So in this video we're going to talk briefly about the aerodynamics, and I'm going to focus on specifically those aspects relating to gliding. And then we're going to use a flight simulator called X-Plane 11 to demonstrate an actual glide and landing in the Space Shuttle. So we're now going to cover some of the aerodynamics of gliding and talk about the forces involved and how we can manage the energy during the glide to arrive at the runway at the correct landing speed. Now, aerodynamics and gliding, this is a crash course on how to land the Space Shuttle. Now, we could spend weeks talking about aerodynamics, but what I have tried to do here is just highlight the fundamental points that you will need to understand in order to follow the flight demonstration later in the video. Just to give you a bit of background, I am an FAA and CASA rated air transport pilot. I hold a CASA commercial helicopter license. I have 10,000 hours total, 3,000 hours on helicopters. I'm a grade 1 flight instructor, a CASA ATO, that means air test officer, which allows me to conduct flight tests. I can train and test flight instructors. I'm also qualified as an air crash investigator, and my specialty was aerodynamics and flight path analysis, and I have presented evidence in coroner's court many times as the lead investigator in over 30 fatal air crashes within Australia. So let's have a look at some of the terminology, and what I'm going to do is just go through the main points very quickly. Talking about aerodynamics for too long can be a total drag, so I'll try to keep it short and interesting. Firstly, the aerofoil. The aerofoil is the shape of the wing, as you can see here with this blue outline. That's called the aerofoil. The chord is the distance from the front to the back of a wing. So from the leading edge, the front edge, to the trailing edge, that distance is the chord. The chord line is a straight line from the front to the back of the wing. The relative airflow is the direction of the air as it approaches the wing. So effectively it is the opposite direction to which the aircraft is flying. You can see this blue line represents the relative wind. This is the wing, and there is the chord line. The next point is the angle of attack, and this is the angle between the chord line and the relative airflow. You can see this red dotted line represents the chord line, and this arrow represents the relative wind, and this angle is the angle of attack. And here we have three separate aerofoils, each at a different angle of attack. The top one has 5 degrees, the middle one has 10 degrees angle of attack, and the bottom one has 20 degrees angle of attack. Next we look at the aspect ratio. This is the ratio of the wingspan to the chord. So something like a glider has a large wingspan in relation to its chord. So its aspect ratio in this case is 33.5 to 1. Compare that to a Piper Cherokee, which has a shorter wing and a larger chord relative to that wingspan. It has an aspect ratio of 5.6 to 1. And the reason we need to understand that will become clear later. Now we start to look at lift and drag. Lift is the force perpendicular to the relative airflow, and drag is the force parallel to the relative airflow. So this diagram shows the relative wind. The angle of attack is the angle between the relative wind and the chord line, and these blue lines represent the lift vector and the drag vector. Lift is perpendicular to the relative airflow and drag is parallel to the relative airflow. So let's now take a look at the lift formula, and don't get too bogged down with it because all we're really concerned with is this summary. The lift generated by a wing is a function of the coefficient of lift, which is the angle of attack and the wing shape, times a half rho, and that is the air density, times the velocity squared times the wing surface area. Now, as a pilot, some of these elements we have no control over. We can't control the air density, and we can't effectively change the wing surface area. So we can eliminate those variables from the lift, and we're left with the coefficient of lift and the velocity. So we can control the angle of attack of the aircraft. We do that with the elevator control, the control yoke, which we can move fore and aft. That directly controls the angle of attack on the wing. And we can control the airspeed. But it's important to note that in the lift equation, the velocity is squared. So the summary: lift increases when angle of attack increases and when speed increases. Looking at the drag formula, it is effectively exactly the same thing. Drag is a half rho times the surface area of the wing times the coefficient of drag, which is again angle of attack and wing shape, and velocity squared. So again, all we are concerned with is what we can control as a pilot. We can increase the drag when the angle of attack increases or when the speed increases. These are the only two elements that we have control over as a pilot. And before moving on to the next point, I just want to emphasize this velocity squared relationship, because what that means is that when we double our speed, we will experience 4 times the amount of drag. Now that could be useful to us if we are trying to bleed off excess energy. It's counterintuitive in a way, but if you are very high and you are too fast, the best way to remove that energy is to dive and increase your speed, because that speed increase will result in a significant increase in drag. If you double the speed, you have 4 times the drag. So it is a very effective way to bleed off excess energy in a glide, in addition to pulling a tight turn, because that will result in an angle of attack increase. So we can reduce the energy of our aircraft if we are going too fast or if we are too high by increasing speed and increasing the angle of attack. It's a very effective way to bleed energy. So just remember that squared relationship. It will come up later. So the next point is the lift to drag ratio, and that is a comparison of how much lift the wing is generating to how much drag is being produced. The better the lift to drag ratio, the further the aircraft can glide from a given altitude. Something like a glider with long skinny wings, a high aspect ratio, will have a better lift to drag ratio than something like the Space Shuttle with short stubby wings and a low aspect ratio. This diagram just shows a comparison of the amount of lift being generated, this blue line, to the amount of drag being generated, this red line. And as your angle of attack varies, the lift to drag ratio varies. So there are a number of factors affecting lift to drag ratio: the overall aircraft design, the aspect ratio, and also the angle of attack that you are flying at. And the glide ratio, as we mentioned, is directly proportional to the lift to drag ratio. If your lift to drag ratio is 10 to 1, the glide ratio will be 10 to 1. So for example, if you have 1,000 feet of altitude with a LD ratio of 10 to 1, you could glide 10,000 feet horizontally. A high aspect ratio aircraft will generally have a higher lift to drag ratio, so the glide ratio will be better. A high performance glider can have a lift to drag ratio of 40 to 1, so that means from 1,000 feet it could glide horizontally 40,000 feet. A low aspect ratio aircraft, such as the Space Shuttle, you can see the wingspan is quite low in comparison to the chord. The shuttle has a lift to drag ratio at subsonic speeds of about 4 to 1, so it does not glide very well. However, it is still perfectly capable of being controlled in a glide. So now we're going to take a look at the forces in a glide. There are two diagrams here representing the weight, the lift being generated by the wing, the drag on the aircraft, and this force labeled T is normally thrust if you have an engine, but because we don't have an engine in a glide, we need some way of generating this forward force, and we can only do that in a glide by descending. And by descending, the path of the glide allows a portion of this weight to act in the direction of flight. So it's a component of the weight acting in opposition to the drag, and that's why in a glide the aircraft is going down. So these are the forces involved. We've got weight, lift, drag, and a component of the weight pulling forward opposing the drag. So now we're getting to the final part of this portion of the video. We're going to talk about energy management. Now, if we consider kinetic energy as the speed of the aircraft, potential energy as the altitude, the total energy state will therefore be the speed plus the altitude. Now, in a glide, we have to constantly manage that energy so that we don't arrive at the runway flying too fast. If we are too fast when we land, we can blow tires, we can overshoot the runway. We also don't want to have too little energy, in which case we may not even reach the runway. So in a glide, we are constantly assessing and evaluating our total energy state and adjusting the horizontal flight path of the aircraft so that it is positioned for landing at the correct energy state. So we need the correct speed and altitude to arrive at the beginning of the runway at a suitable speed for landing. Now remember, if we are needing to bleed energy, this means we are reducing the speed and or the altitude. In a glide, we can control the airspeed by raising the nose, and that will cause the aircraft to slow down, or we can lower the nose to speed up. However, if we want to bleed off energy, an effective way to do that is to actually increase speed. As I said earlier, it is counterintuitive. If you are too high and too fast, you don't want to raise the nose to slow down, because that would actually put you in a worse situation. What you need to do is lower the nose, increase speed, and because an increase in speed by a factor of 2 will give you a drag increase by a factor of 4, it is a very effective way to bleed your energy. So in summary, if you have too much energy, the way to remove that is to dive and perform tight turns. And in the actual flight demonstration, you will see me doing that several times. So in the next part of the video, we're going to take a look at a small aerofoil simulator that is running in real time, and we can adjust elements such as the angle of attack, the airspeed, and the aspect ratio, and observe what effect that has on the lift to drag ratio. Before I move on to the simulator, I'll just give flat earthers watching a few minutes to sit down, because I don't want any of you to have a heart attack when you see where this simulator comes from. So here's the simulator, and yes, it's on the NASA website. It's an excellent tool for visualizing the way a wing's aerofoil works, and you can adjust all the parameters and see the effect on drag ratio, on pressure distribution, and various other factors. But let's just look at the elements that we discussed in the briefing. This is the aerofoil. The streamlines are showing how the air is flowing below and above the aerofoil. Now, with these sliders, we can in real time adjust the angle of attack, and you can see the angle of attack value is displayed here. We can increase the angle of attack. As we do that, we get a differential pressure on the upper surface and on the lower surface of the wing. So just watch what occurs there as we adjust this angle of attack. Now, something I haven't mentioned as yet is an aerodynamic stall, and the best way to just see that is if I increase the angle of attack too much. You can see as I'm increasing that angle of attack, the streamlines are sticking to the upper surface of the wing. In fact, we can demonstrate it like that. It's more effective. Now, if I increase the angle of attack too much, it breaks away, and it is that breaking away of the airflow because the angle of attack is excessive that is known as an aerodynamic stall. If we reduce the angle of attack, we recover from the stall. So there's the stall, there's the stall recovery. We can view this in a side 3D view. There's the stall, there's the stall recovery. So essentially, while we are flying the aircraft and managing our energy, we have to be careful not to exceed what is called the critical angle, and that is where the airflow breaks apart from the top of the surface of the wing. And when that happens, you effectively lose control of the aircraft until you reduce the angle of attack below the stalling angle. So just looking at some other factors, over here we have the lift value and the drag value and the lift to drag ratio. You can see 322 pounds of lift, 49 pounds of drag, gives us a lift to drag ratio of 6.566 to 1. Now, if I change the angle of attack, you can see the value of lift and drag changing, and also the lift to drag ratio changing. Now we can have a look at different plots here. We can have a look at drag versus the angle. This graph is now showing the amount of drag versus the angle of attack on the wing. As I change that angle of attack, the amount of drag is changing. We can have a look at drag versus speed. Now remember, I mentioned that if we double the speed, we get 4 times the drag. Well, you can see that exponential ratio in the curve here. As we double the speed, we get 4 times the drag. If we change the speed of the aircraft, you can see the overall value of lift and drag is increasing. If we reduce the speed, the amount of lift and drag is reducing. So if we have a look here, we have 100 miles per hour with 47 pounds of drag. If we double that speed to 200 miles per hour, we now have 174 pounds of drag. So effectively 4 times the amount of drag for doubling the speed. And the final thing I want to demonstrate is just changing the aspect ratio of the wing and how it affects the lift to drag ratio. So if we go to size, here we can adjust the chord and the wingspan, which changes the aspect ratio. You can see we have a short stubby wing and it's giving us a lift to drag ratio of 8.269. If I increase the chord, you can see that lift to drag ratio is reducing further still. If I reduce the chord, the lift to drag ratio is increasing. If I increase the wingspan, you can see the lift to drag ratio is increasing quite dramatically there. It's now more than 20 to 1, and that is why gliders have long skinny wings like that. The Space Shuttle has a short stubby wing and therefore it has a very low lift to drag ratio. So let's take a look at this flight simulator, X-Plane 11. It's probably one of the best flight simulators I've ever used on a PC. It has excellent graphics and the general feel of the aircraft is quite realistic, as good as you could expect on a home-based flight simulator. I've been using X-Plane since about version 3, so for many years, and certainly X-Plane 11 is the best version yet. It allows you to fly scenarios and it records the entire flight path data so that you can replay the flight as many times as you want and view it from different angles. Now, I produced a flight the other day and I will be reviewing that flight later in this video. So let's take a look at the simulator itself, the interface, and then I will play the actual landing of the Space Shuttle. So there's the interface for X-Plane. As you can see, you have a variety of aircraft and you can search for any airport using the standard ICAO code. So let's pick Los Angeles, KLAX, and let's start a new flight. Now there's the cockpit view. Internally, you can pan left and right. You can have a full screen view without the cockpit. And then you have various external views. And in those external views, you can pan around or up and down. And you also have various flyby views. So let's take a look at landing the Space Shuttle. So this is a flight I did the other day, and I'm just letting the video run and I'll do the commentary as we're flying. Now, when I did the actual flight, I did the entire thing using only this view and also the in-cockpit view, this one. Just have a look quickly. That's the indicated airspeed and that's the altitude. This starts off at 83,000 feet. For the purpose of the demonstration, I'll just show some of the external views as well. Now what I was doing at this point was just flying along, and very shortly I will lower the nose to identify the location of the airport. And there you can see it, just right below us, so we're very high and traveling very fast. So the first thing I decided to do was just pull some high G maneuvers. And that way we can lose altitude without gaining too much airspeed. Now it's perfectly safe to fly aerobatics in any aircraft as long as you don't exceed the structural limit. And because I'm so high at this point, still 45,000 feet, I was able to dive without worrying about the indicated airspeed becoming excessive. As you can see there, I'm in a steep dive, However, I'm pulling a lot of G, and that is maintaining a positive angle of attack on the wing, and because of the high indicated airspeed, we are bleeding off energy nicely. It's a bit unorthodox. Obviously you would not land the space shuttle this way, but you certainly can fly it more aggressively than it was actually flown during real missions. And I was just having a bit of fun here while I was bleeding off the energy. The simulator will result in a crash if you exceed the G loading of the aircraft, or if you fly too fast. In fact, if you land too fast, you can even blow a tyre. So at this point, I'm just confirming my position. You can see I've got 420 knots. And I'm just bringing the aircraft round in a final tight turn to line up with the runway. And I'm deliberately diving low to bleed off that energy. And you will see that I level off, and flying level allows me to wash off the airspeed very effectively. So there's the runway straight ahead. So we're now low and fast. So we've removed our potential energy. We just need to get rid of our kinetic energy. And because we have several miles to the runway, there's plenty of distance to do that. So I just do a little zoom climb to bring myself back onto the glide path, simultaneously reducing airspeed. We get the landing gear out shortly. And at this point, I'm just managing the energy to put the wheels down right on the threshold with as low a landing speed as possible. The speed is continually washing off at this stage, and I'm just holding off and progressively increasing the angle of attack as the aircraft is slowing down. Now, I was using a mouse here, so that's my excuse for the little bounce that occurs. I don't normally fly aircraft using a mouse. But overall, you'll see that the energy state is now quite low. The aircraft has a high nose attitude, and we get the wheels down right on the threshold. As I said, when I was actually flying this, I was using the internal cockpit views. And the beauty of the replay system is that you can rewind and watch the approach from a different angle. So this is the same approach, now looking at it from a different angle. And you can really see how I was just managing the angle of attack in the last part of the landing. Just do a little flare there to avoid touching down. Reduce the nose just slightly to put the wheels down. It bounced slightly, but as I said, that's just because I was using a mouse. That's my excuse anyway. But still able to stop in less than half of the runway. So when it comes to gliding the space shuttle, absolutely yes, it can glide. It glides quite well. I recommend having a go at this simulator. It's a lot of fun.